Your Honor, this claim is from 1970. The plaintiff is asking this court to honor a piece of paper older than half the people in this room. With respect, it should be dismissed before the lunch recess. The lawyer said it loud enough for the gallery to hear. A few people laughed. One of the bank's junior associates didn't even try to hide his smile. Walter Pence sat at the plaintiff's table in a clean white shirt, hands folded, eyes on the judge's bench. He was 73 years old. He had not spoken since the bailiff called the case 40 minutes earlier. He did not speak now. The judge, a man named Harold Briggs, who had been on the federal bench for 19 years, looked down at the document in front of him. Then he looked at the bank's lawyer, then back at the document. "Motion to dismiss," Judge Briggs said. "Granted. The 1970 claim is not enforceable as presented. We'll take a 15-minute recess before the next matter." The gavel came down. The bank's lawyer turned to his associates and clapped one of them lightly on the shoulder. Walter did not move. His own lawyer, a woman named Susan Reyes, leaned over and whispered something to him. He nodded once. He still did not move. 46 years he had been on that land, 46 years, 3 months, 11 days. And in the space of 40 seconds, a federal judge had thrown out the only document that proved any of it belonged to him. He stood up slowly. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He walked out of the courtroom. It was 11:14 in the morning. By 11:42, the clerk of the court, a woman named Doreen Halsey, who had been processing federal filings in that building for 31 years, would walk into Judge Briggs's chambers carrying something the bank's lawyer had not seen, did not know existed, and would have given a great deal of money to make disappear. But that came later. Walter Pence was born in 1953 in Polk County, Iowa, on the same 160 acres of corn and soybean ground his grandfather had broken with a team of horses in 1919. His father, Earl Pence, took over the farm in 1948, married a schoolteacher named Margaret 2 years later, and never lived more than a quarter-mile from the place he was born. When Walter was 20, his father called him into the kitchen one evening in October of 1972 and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "This is the deed," Earl said. "Yours when I'm gone. Don't sell it. Don't borrow against it. Don't trust a man who tells you it's worth more as something else than it is as a farm." Walter took the paper. He didn't unfold it. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and went back outside to finish unloading the wagon. Earl Pence died in March of 1979. Margaret followed 11 years later. Walter buried them both under the bur oak at the north edge of the property, the one his grandfather had planted as a sapling in 1921 and that now threw shade over a quarter-acre of pasture in the summer. He worked the farm alone for 22 years. He married late, a widow named Elaine Peterson from the next county over, in 1995. She had a son from her first marriage, a boy named Mark, who was 9 years old when he came to live on the Pence place and 26 when he moved to Des Moines to take a job at an insurance company. Elaine died of pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2018. Mark came home for the funeral and stayed 3 days. By the spring of 2024, Walter was farming 512 acres, the original 160-plus parcels he had added in 1988, 1996, and 2007. And he was doing it almost entirely by himself. He hired help during planting and harvest. The rest of the year it was him, 2 dogs, and a 1987 John Deere tractor that he'd rebuilt twice. He kept his father's deed in a metal box in the bedroom closet. The box had been Earl's. Before that, it had been his grandfather's. Walter had not opened it in 19 years. The letter from Cargan Equity Holdings arrived on a Tuesday in February of 2026. It said that a 1968 land grant filed in Polk County by one Earl T. Pence had been reviewed and found to contain a clerical error in the meets and bounds description. It said that Cargan Equity Holdings, as the successor in interest to the original grantor, a railroad company that had gone bankrupt in 1981, was filing a claim of reversion on approximately 340 acres of the Pence property. It said Walter had 30 days to respond. Walter read the letter twice. Then he drove into Des Moines to see a lawyer. Susan Reyes was 41 years old. She had been practicing land use and property law for 14 years. When Walter sat down across from her and slid the letter and his father's deed across her desk, She read both documents 3 times before she spoke. "This is going to be hard," she said. "Not because you're wrong, because they're betting you can't prove you're right. The 1968 grant they're referring to predates your father's deed by 4 years. If a court accepts their version of the boundary, we lose almost everything west of the county road." "What do we have?" Walter asked. "We have the 1972 deed your father gave you," Susan said. "But that deed references the 1968 grant. So if the 1968 grant is defective, the 1972 deed inherits the defect. We need the original 1968 document, not the recorded copy. The original, with the original surveyor's marks." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "My father had a tube," he said. "In the workshop. Long cardboard tube. He used to say everything important was in it." "When did you last see it?" 47 years ago. The man behind Cargan Equity Holdings was named Marcus Holloway. He was 36 years old, a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, and the lead corporate attorney for a firm that specialized in what their website called legacy asset recovery. In the previous 4 years, Marcus Holloway had filed 29 reversion claims against rural property owners in 7 states. 23 had settled out of court. 4 had gone to trial. Cargan had won all 4. Holloway had spent approximately 2 hours and 10 minutes on the Pence file before drafting the initial letter. He had spent another 40 minutes reviewing it before filing the claim in federal court. By his own internal billing records, which would later become relevant, he had spent a total of 19 hours and 40 minutes on Walter Pence's case before the morning of the hearing. He arrived at the federal courthouse in Des Moines in a charcoal suit with 2 associates beside him, both younger than 30, both carrying matching black leather folders. He had told the associates over breakfast that the case would be over before lunch. He was not wrong about the timing. He was wrong about the outcome. Walter found the cardboard tube on the 3rd day of looking. It was in the back of his father's old workshop, behind a stack of seed catalogs from the 1970s, leaning against the wall in a corner where the roof had leaked at some point and left a stain on the floorboards. The tube was about 30 inches long. The cap on one end was sealed with masking tape that had gone yellow and brittle. On the side of the tube, in his father's careful handwriting, was a label. Survey, Original, 1968, Halverson. Walter sat down on his father's workbench and held the tube in both hands. He did not open it. He drove it directly into Des Moines and put it on Susan Reyes's desk. She put on cotton gloves before she touched the tape. Inside the tube was a single rolled document, hand-drawn on thick paper, slightly yellowed but intact. It was a survey map of 160 acres of Polk County farmland. The meets and bounds were drawn by hand in black ink. The signature at the bottom read, Halverson J., Licensed Surveyor, State of Iowa, 1968. The boundary lines on the original survey did not match the boundary lines that Cargan Equity Holdings had submitted to the court. Susan Reyes took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "Mr. Pence," she said, "the recorded copy at the county was redrawn in 1971. Someone changed it. The original, your father's original, has the correct lines. We need to file this with the court before the hearing." "How much time do we have?" 11 days. "Will it be enough?" Susan looked at the document on her desk for a long time before she answered. "It should be," she said. "But these things don't always go the way they should. They have lawyers who eat documents like this for breakfast." Walter nodded. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot for a while. "My father was a careful man," he said. "He didn't keep things he didn't need." The hearing was set for the morning of April 14, 2026, in Federal Courtroom 3B, Judge Harold Briggs presiding. Susan filed a motion to introduce the original 1968 survey as new evidence. The motion was granted. A copy was sent to opposing counsel. Cargan's lawyers had 9 days to review it. What happened in those 9 days, Walter would only learn later. Marcus Holloway looked at the original survey, called his lead investigator, and asked one question. "Is this real?" The investigator took 6 days to answer. The answer was, probably. Holloway's response was to file a motion challenging the authenticity of the document. He argued that any survey produced from a private workshop after 58 years could not be reliably authenticated, that the chain of custody was broken, and that the only legally recognized version of the 1968 survey was the one on file with the Polk County Recorder's Office. Judge Briggs scheduled a hearing on the motion for the morning of April 14, 2026, immediately preceding the main case. Walter wore a clean white shirt that Elaine had bought him in 2017. He had ironed it himself. He drove to Des Moines alone in his pickup, the same one he had driven for 16 years. Marcus Holloway spoke first in the courtroom. He spoke for 19 minutes. He used phrases like evidentiary integrity and the burden of authentication. He was very good at it. He gestured to his associates who handed him documents at the right moments. He never raised his voice. When he was finished, he turned to Susan Reyes with a small, polite smile and sat down. Susan stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "we have a survey from 1968 with the original surveyor's signature. We have a chain of custody from Earl Pence to Walter Pence dating to 1972. The county's recorded version, dated 1971, is materially different from the original. Either the county's copy is wrong, or my client's is. We are asking this court to allow a forensic comparison." Marcus Holloway stood up again before she finished her sentence. "Your Honor, this court is being asked to admit a 60-year-old document found in a barn. The chain of custody is a single elderly farmer's recollection. The proper venue for this kind of claim is not federal court. It is folklore." He smiled when he said it. The bank's associates smiled. One of them, the one in the back, actually laughed out loud. Walter Pence did not move. Judge Briggs looked at the documents in front of him for a long time. Then he looked at Marcus Holloway. "Counselor," he said, "I'm going to grant your motion. The 1968 survey, as submitted by the plaintiff, is not authenticated to the standard required. The 1970 claim, which depends on it, is dismissed. We'll take a 15-minute recess." The gavel came down. Walter stood up. He picked up his hat. He walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. In the hallway, Susan Reyes caught up with him. "We can appeal," she said. "We can file again. We have other options." "How long?" 2 years, maybe 3. Walter looked at her. "I'm 73, he said. He turned and walked toward the elevator. He never made it to the elevator. The clerk of the court, Doreen Halsey, had been processing federal filings in that building for 31 years. She had filed the original survey when Susan Reyes submitted it 9 days earlier. She had also, as part of standard procedure, requested the original recorded version from the Polk County Recorder's Archive for comparison. The archive had sent her a sealed envelope containing the 1971 document. She had not opened the envelope until that morning. She had not been asked to. The motion had been about authentication of the plaintiff's document, not the county's. But Doreen Halsey was a careful woman. After Judge Briggs ruled, she went back to her office, opened the sealed envelope from the county archive, and laid the 1971 recorded survey on her desk next to a photocopy of the 1968 original. The lines were different. She had expected that. That was the entire dispute. But there was something else. Something the court had not been asked to examine. On the back of the 1971 recorded survey in faded ink was a notation she had seen perhaps 3 times in her 31 years. It was a county recorder's stamp from 1971, certifying that the survey had been redrawn from the original on file. Beneath it, in a different hand, was a second notation. It said, "Original returned to Earl T. Pence, March 14, 1972, per request." Doreen Halsey sat at her desk for a full minute looking at that notation. Then she picked up both documents and walked them down the hall to Judge Briggs's chambers. What she said to him, no one outside that room ever heard. What is on the record is this. At 11:58 a.m. on April 14, 2026, Judge Harold Briggs reconvened the court, vacated his earlier ruling, and ordered the immediate authentication of the 1968 original by a state-licensed forensic document examiner. He further ordered Cargan Equity Holdings to produce, by the close of business, the complete chain of custody record for the 1971 recorded version, including the name of the individual who had submitted it for re-recording. Marcus Holloway objected. Judge Briggs overruled him. The forensic examiner arrived the following Monday. She confirmed in a sworn affidavit that the 1968 original was authentic, that the surveyor's signature matched 2 other Halverson surveys filed in Polk County in the same year, and that the 1971 recorded version had been produced from a deliberately altered tracing, not a redraw of the original. The chain of custody record from Cargan revealed something else. The 1971 alteration had been filed by a Polk County employee named Harlan Cargan, the grandfather of the firm's founder. Harlan Cargan had been the deputy recorder in 1971. He had altered the survey before refiling it. He had then, 50 years later, sold the resulting claim to a holding company owned by his grandson. The case was reopened. It did not go to trial. Cargan Equity Holdings withdrew the reversion claim within 72 hours. Marcus Holloway filed a settlement offer the following Tuesday. Full quitclaim of any interest in the Pence property, plus damages of $420,000 for the cost of the proceedings and the pattern of fraud. Susan Reyes called Walter from her office. "We won," she said. "It's over." There was a long silence on the line. "Thank you," Walter said. "I'll come by next week to sign whatever you need." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while. Then he put on his coat and walked out across the yard, past the workshop, past the equipment shed, up the long slope to the north edge of the property where the bur oak stood over 2 graves and a stretch of pasture his grandfather had cleared by hand. It was late afternoon. The sun was low. The shadow of the oak reached almost to the fence line. Walter stopped beside his father's headstone. He took off his hat and held it in both hands. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "You kept the right one, Dad." He put his hat back on. He turned and walked back down the slope toward the house. Some men leave their children money. Some leave them land. Earl Pence left his son a cardboard tube in the back of a workshop and a single instruction not to trust the version that came later. It took 54 years for that gift to come due. It was worth every one of them. Walter Pence was not the only farmer in Polk County to receive a letter from Cargan Equity Holdings. There were 11 others. Same template, same 30-day deadline, same altered surveys filed by the same hand in 1971. Their cases are still open. What the original survey in Walter's father's workshop will mean for the other 11, and for the dozens more in 3 other states, is a story we are still putting together. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The next one is bigger than this one. Paste your script.